In a quiet neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, where the streets were lined with old oaks and the sound of passing trains hummed like a lullaby at night, a 12-year-old boy named Mateo lived in a small brick house with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked with every breeze. His room was tucked under the roof, just big enough for a narrow bed, a second-hand desk, and a bookshelf overflowing with library books mostly about music, even though he'd never taken a formal lesson. Mateo wasn't the kind of kid who stood out in school. He spoke softly, kept his eyes down during class discussions, and rarely raised his hand unless called on directly. His teachers described him as thoughtful or reserved, and his classmates mostly forgot he was there, until music period. That's when something shifted. During choir practice, while others mumbled through scales or giggled off-key, Mateo's voice would rise, clear, steady, and strangely full for someone so slight. It wasn't loud, but it carried, like a single note of sunlight breaking through clouds. His parents, both public school educators, hadn't planned for any of this. They loved music. His mother sometimes hummed old folk songs while grading papers, and his father kept a dusty record player in the basement. But they never pushed their son toward it. In fact, they barely noticed his talent at first. He never sang around the house, never practiced out loud. He just disappeared into his room after school, headphones clamped over his ears, listening to recordings of voices that seemed to belong to another century. It started when he was 6. One rainy afternoon, stuck inside with a cold, he'd wandered into the living room and found his father watching an old movie. Halfway through, a man in a tuxedo stood alone on a balcony and began to sing. The melody was slow, soaring, full of longing. Mateo froze. He didn't understand the words, they were in Italian, but something in the sound made his chest tighten. He asked his father what it was. "That's opera," his dad said, surprised. "Pavarotti, one of the greats." Mateo didn't say anything else, but that night he Googled the song. Then he listened to it again, and again. By morning, he'd memorized the tune. From then on, opera became his secret world. He devoured recordings, Callas, Domingo, Tebaldi, studying not just the notes, but the breaths between them, the way a voice could tremble with joy or crack with sorrow. He mimicked their phrasing in the shower, in the empty hallway at school, in the quiet moments before sleep. He never told anyone, not because he was ashamed, but because it felt too personal, like sharing a dream while you're still living it. At school, he stayed invisible. He ate lunch alone most days, sketching musical notes in the margins of his notebooks instead of joining the lunchroom chatter. Kids didn't bully him exactly, they just didn't see him. And that was fine. He preferred it that way. Until one Tuesday in March, it was choir rehearsal, and the class was struggling through a simple arrangement of Amazing Grace. The teacher, Ms. Delgado, had been trying for weeks to get them to harmonize without shouting over each other. Frustrated, she stopped the group and asked if anyone wanted to sing a solo verse, just one line, to demonstrate how it should sound. Silence. Then, from the back row, a small voice, "I can try." Everyone turned. Even Ms. Delgado blinked in surprise. She knew Mateo could carry a tune, but she'd never heard him sing alone. "Go ahead," she said gently. He stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the floor. He took a breath, slowed deep, and began. Not the simplified version they'd been practicing, but the full, ornamented melody as it was meant to be sung, with grace notes and a gentle swell on the word grace. His voice didn't waver. It didn't strain. It simply filled the room like warm air rising. When he finished, no one clapped right away. They just stared. Then Ms. Delgado smiled, really smiled, and said, "Mateo, have you ever thought about joining the city's youth arts program?" He shook his head. "They hold auditions every spring," she said. "It's for kids with something special to share. You don't have to perform on stage. You can sing behind a screen if you want, just so they can hear you clearly." Mateo didn't answer that day, but that night he lay awake thinking about it. The idea of strangers hearing him, really hearing him, made his stomach twist. But the thought of never trying, of keeping this part of himself locked away forever, felt worse. He mentioned it to his parents over dinner a few days later. They exchanged glances. "Are you sure?" his mother asked. "You don't have to do this just because your teacher suggested it." "I know," he said quietly. "But I want to." His father reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Then we'll figure it out together. The audition was scheduled for a Saturday in April. Ms. Delgado helped him pick a piece. Ave Maria, simple but expressive, and practiced with him after school twice a week. She never pushed, never praised too loudly. She just created space for him to be heard. The morning of the audition, Matteo wore his best button-down shirt, slightly too big, and stood outside the community arts center with his parents. His hands were cold. His heart pounded like a drum, but when they called his name, he walked in alone, just as he'd asked, and stood behind the tall folding screen they'd set up for shy performers. He sang. Not for judges, not for approval, just for the music. Afterward, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes came out to thank him. "You have a rare gift," she said. "We'd love to invite you to a special event next month, a dinner performance by Elena Rossi. She's a professional opera singer, and she's doing a community night at Il Giardino. We think you'd enjoy it, and, well, she likes to meet young voices when she can." Matteo didn't know who Elena Rossi was, but his parents did. They exchanged another look, this one full of wonder and worry. That night, over spaghetti and garlic bread, his mother said, "It's expensive, but maybe we can make it work." His father nodded. "Once in a lifetime, right?" Matteo didn't say much, but inside something fluttered, a mix of fear and hope he couldn't name. He'd never been to a fancy restaurant, never seen a real opera singer live, and now he was being invited not just as an audience member, but as someone who belonged in that world, even just for an evening. In the days leading up to the event, he listened to Elena Rossi's recordings obsessively. Her voice was rich and warm, like dark chocolate melting in sunlight. She sang with power, yes, but also with kindness. There was no showiness, no strain, just truth. The night of the dinner arrived. Matteo wore the same shirt from the audition, now neatly pressed. His parents dressed up too, his mother in a simple black dress, his father in a suit he hadn't worn since his sister's wedding. They drove downtown, parked a few blocks away, and walked the rest under streetlights that flickered like distant stars. Il Giardino was smaller than Matteo expected. Just a dozen tables, soft lighting, the smell of rosemary and simmering tomatoes in the air. A baby grand piano sat in the corner, and near it a woman in an emerald green dress tuned a microphone. That must be her. They were shown to a table near the back. Matteo sat with his hands in his lap, eyes darting everywhere. The wine glasses, the candles, the other guests in their nice clothes. He felt out of place, like he'd wandered into someone else's story. Then the lights dimmed slightly. Elena stepped forward, smiled at the room, and began to sing. From the first note, Matteo forgot to breathe. It wasn't just her voice, it was how she held the room, how she made everyone lean in as if sharing a secret. She sang Libiamo nei lieti calici from La Traviata, then a haunting piece from Carmen. Each phrase was alive, full of color and feeling. Matteo mouthed the words under his breath, his fingers tapping the rhythm on his knee. Halfway through the set, Elena paused. "Opera," she said, "isn't just for concert halls. It's for everyone. And sometimes the most beautiful moments happen when we share it together." She looked around the room. "Would anyone like to join me for a duet? Just one song, nothing fancy. Maybe O Sole Mio?" Silence. People glanced at each other, smiling nervously. No one moved. Then from the back table, Ms. Delgado, who'd come as a guest, leaned over and whispered something to Matteo's mother. His mother nodded, then gently touched his arm. Matteo's stomach dropped. His palms went slick, but something deeper, something quiet and sure, rose up inside him. He stood. No one knew who he was. No one expected anything, and maybe that was the point. As he walked toward the small space near the piano, the room fell still. Elena turned, surprised. She saw a boy, small, serious, eyes wide with nerves, but something in his posture told her he wasn't there by accident. She knelt slightly to meet his height. "What would you like to sing?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "O Sole Mio. If that's okay," she smiled. "It's perfect." And in that moment, with the scent of garlic and candle wax in the air, and the weight of 100 curious eyes on him, Matteo did the one thing he'd always done in secret. He sang. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Matteo stood near the piano, heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. His legs trembled. He kept his eyes on the floorboards, worn smooth by years of footsteps, trying to anchor himself in something solid. Around him, the soft clink of silverware had vanished. Even the hum of the kitchen in the back seemed to quiet down, as if the whole restaurant was holding its breath. Elena didn't rush him. She just waited, calm and steady like a tree in a storm. Then she gave a small nod to the pianist, who began the gentle, familiar opening chords of O Sole Mio. The melody floated into the air, warm, nostalgic, full of longing for light and warmth and home. Matteo took a slow breath, the way Ms. Delgado had taught him, low in the belly, not the chest, and then he sang. His voice came out clear and true, like a bell ringing in an empty chapel. It wasn't loud, but it filled every corner of the room. The high notes didn't strain, they shimmered. The phrasing wasn't copied from a recording. It was his own, shaped by years of listening in secret, of feeling the music more than thinking about it. He sang not to impress, but because the song lived inside him, and now, finally, it had a chance to breathe out loud. Elena watched him for a few seconds, then joined in, not overpowering him, not showing off, but weaving her voice around his like a gentle embrace. Her tone was richer, deeper, seasoned by decades of performance, but she matched his simplicity, his sincerity. Together they turned a well-known Neapolitan classic into something intimate, almost sacred. At a table near the front, a woman dabbed her eyes with a napkin. A man in a chef's coat stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, jaw slightly slack. Waiters paused mid-step, trays in hand. Even the couple who'd been arguing quietly over the wine list fell silent, their hands resting on the table like they'd forgotten why they were upset. When the final note faded, a soft, sustained soul that seemed to hang in the air like sunlight through glass, the room didn't erupt right away. There was a beat of stillness, as if everyone needed a moment to remember where they were. Then someone clapped. Then another. Then the whole restaurant rose to their feet, cheering, whistling, some even wiping tears away. Matteo froze. He didn't know what to do with his hands. He wanted to run back to his seat, to disappear into the safety of the corner table. But before he could move, Elena turned to him, her eyes bright, and knelt so they were eye to eye. That, she said, her voice thick with emotion, was beautiful. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, cheeks burning. She stood, took his hand gently, and raised it like a champion's. The applause grew louder. Someone shouted, "Encore!" But Elena just smiled and shook her head. "Let him breathe," she said softly, though no one but Matteo heard. Back at the table, his parents sat stunned. His mother had tears streaming down her face. His father kept shaking his head, muttering, "I had no idea. I had no idea he could do that." Ms. Delgado beamed, squeezing his mother's shoulder. "He's been like this all along," she whispered. "He just needed the right moment." After the applause settled, the evening resumed, but nothing felt the same. People kept glancing over at Matteo's table. A few came by to say how moved they were. One older gentleman, with a thick accent and a pocket watch, told him, "You have the soul of Caruso." Matteo just mumbled, "Thank you," and stared at his untouched plate of ravioli. Elena finished her set with 2 more arias, but the mood had shifted. There was a new kind of attention in the room, not just appreciation for her, but awe for what had just happened. When she bowed for the final time, she walked straight to Matteo's table. "May I?" she asked, pulling up a chair. His parents nodded, still dazed. She sat, not as a star, but as someone who'd just witnessed something rare. "How long have you been singing like that?" she asked him. "Since I was little," he said quietly, "but only by myself. No teacher." He shook his head. "Just listening," she smiled. "Sometimes that's the best teacher." They talked for a while about music, about nerves, about how scary it is to share something so personal. Elena told him she used to hide in her room too, singing into a hairbrush. "I thought no one would ever care," she said. "Turns out people care more than you think, but only if you let them hear you." Before she left, she handed him a small card. "I'm performing at a benefit concert next month," she said, "for public school music programs. Would you consider singing with me? Just one piece. No pressure. Only if you want to." Matteo looked at the card, then at his parents. They didn't say yes or no. They just waited for him to decide. I'd like to think about it," he said. "That's fair," she replied. "Take your time." She left soon after, but the night didn't end there. On the drive home, no one spoke much. The city lights blurred past the windows. Matteo stared out, replaying every second in his head. The fear, the silence, the sound of his own voice ringing out, and then the overwhelming wave of people reacting. It felt unreal, like a dream he might wake up from. But when they got home, his father turned to him in the driveway and said, "You made people feel something tonight." "That's not small, son. That's huge." Inside, his mother made hot chocolate even though it wasn't cold out. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, sipping in silence. Then his phone buzzed. It was a text from a classmate. "Dude, my mom was at that restaurant. She said you sang like a pro. Is that really you?" He didn't reply. But then another message came from someone he didn't know. Saw the video. "You're incredible." Video? He opened social media. There it was. Shaky phone footage shot from a table near the piano. The caption read, "12-year-old stuns opera singer at downtown restaurant." Already it had thousands of views. Comments poured in. Where did he come from? This gave me chills. Is he on America's Got Talent yet? Matteo's stomach twisted. He showed his parents. His mother frowned. "We didn't know anyone was filming," his father sighed. "Once it's out there, it's out there." They talked about it, about privacy, about pressure, about how quickly things can spiral online. They agreed to be careful. No interviews, no big announcements, just let it be what it was. One night, one song, one honest moment. But the next morning, the video had tens of thousands of views. Local news stations called. A talent scout from Los Angeles left a voicemail. A radio host wanted him on the air live tomorrow. His parents turned them all down. "We're not selling his childhood," his mother told his father that night, voice firm. "He's 12. He needs to be 12. Still, school was different the next day. Whispers followed him down the hall. Kids he'd never spoken to waved at him. The principal stopped him between classes and said, "We're so proud of you." Even the lunch lady gave him an extra cookie. He didn't like it. Not because he was ungrateful, but because it felt like they were celebrating a version of him he didn't recognize. The prodigy, the viral kid, not the quiet boy who just loved to sing when no one was watching. At lunch, he sat alone again, but this time a group of 8th graders came over. "Dude, are you gonna be on TV?" One asked. "I don't know," Matteo said. "You should totally go on that talent show. You'd win for sure," he shrugged. "I don't want to be on a show." They laughed like he was joking. When they walked away, he felt even more alone. That afternoon, Ms. Delgado pulled him aside after choir. "How are you holding up?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It's too much." She nodded. "Fame is loud, but your voice? That's yours, and you get to decide what to do with it." He thought about Elena's invitation. The benefit concert wasn't about fame. It was about music and helping schools that couldn't afford instruments or teachers. That felt right, cleaner, truer. That weekend, he called the number on the card. Elena answered on the second ring. "It's Matteo," he said. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. No surprise in her voice, like she'd been waiting. "I'll do it," he said. "The concert. If it's still okay." "It's more than okay," she replied. "And don't worry, we'll keep it simple. Just you, me, and the music." In the weeks that followed, they met twice at a small rehearsal studio downtown. No cameras, no audience. Just a piano, 2 chairs, and the slow work of building trust through song. Elena didn't treat him like a child or a novelty. She treated him like a fellow musician, correcting his breath support gently, suggesting slight changes in tempo, always asking, "How does that feel to you?" He began to relax, to enjoy it, to remember why he'd fallen in love with singing in the first place. His parents came to one rehearsal. They sat in the back, silent, watching their son stand a little taller each time he sang. Afterward, Elena spoke with them privately. "I don't want to push him," she said. "This isn't about launching a career. It's about giving him a chance to share his gift in a space that honors it." They believed her, and for the first time since that night at the restaurant, they felt at ease. As the concert date neared, Matteo didn't tell his classmates. He practiced quietly at home, humming scales while brushing his teeth, running phrases in his head during math class. He wasn't nervous, not like before. This time he knew what to expect. And more importantly, he knew why he was doing it, not for views, not for praise, but because music had given him a voice when he felt voiceless. And now maybe it could help others find theirs too. The night before the concert, He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Outside, a train rumbled past, its sound familiar and comforting. He thought about the restaurant, the silence before he sang, the way the room changed after. He thought about Elena's steady presence, his parents' quiet pride, the way his own voice had surprised even him. He wasn't a star. He wasn't a phenomenon. He was just a boy who loved to sing, and tomorrow he would do it again. Not in secret, not for fame, but because it felt right. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let your true self be heard, even if your hands are shaking, and that, he realized, was enough. The morning of the benefit concert dawned gray and drizzly, the kind of Chicago spring day that feels like the sky can't decide whether to cry or clear up. Mateo woke early anyway. He hadn't slept much. Not from nerves this time, but from a quiet kind of anticipation, like standing at the edge of a lake just before sunrise, waiting for the water to catch the first light. His parents were already up. His mother was making pancakes, humming softly under her breath, a habit she only had on important days. His father sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reading the local paper, though Mateo noticed his eyes kept drifting to the clock. "You don't have to do this," his mother said gently, flipping a pancake with more care than usual. "If you wake up and it doesn't feel right, we turn around." "No questions," Mateo shook his head. "It feels right," and it did. Not exciting, not scary, just right. Like putting on a jacket that finally fits after years of wearing 1-2 sizes too big. They drove downtown in near silence, the windshield wipers keeping time with the radio playing low in the background. The concert was being held at a historic theater on the north side, not huge but grand in that old-fashioned way, with red velvet seats and a ceiling painted like a night sky. It was being used for the first time in years for a public school fundraiser, and the lobby buzzed with volunteers, teachers, students, and families carrying instrument cases and sheet music. Backstage smelled like dust, wood polish, and faint traces of old perfume. Elena was already there, warming up in a corner with a scarf draped over her shoulders. She smiled when she saw him. "Ready?" He nodded. They didn't rehearse again. They didn't need to. They'd chosen Panis Angelicus, a gentle spiritual piece that didn't demand showy high notes but asked for something deeper. Stillness, sincerity, shared breath. It was perfect. Backstage, Mateo changed into the outfit they'd agreed on. Dark slacks, a white shirt, no tie. Nothing flashy. Just clean, simple, like he was going to school, except his heart beat a little faster. And his hands stayed cool no matter how many times he rubbed them together. Elena checked in with the stage manager, then came back and sat beside him on a folding chair. "You know," she said quietly, "the first time I sang in a real theater, I forgot the words halfway through. Just stood there frozen." Mateo looked at her, surprised. "What did you do?" "I laughed. And the audience laughed with me. Then I started again. And you know what? People remembered that moment more than any perfect note I'd ever sung." He thought about that. Perfection wasn't the point. Truth was, the concert began with a string quartet from a high school on the west side. Kids who'd never played outside their classroom before. Then a young pianist, maybe 14, performed a Chopin nocturne with trembling fingers but steady focus. Each act was introduced by a teacher, their voice thick with pride. This wasn't a competition. It was a celebration of music kept alive in underfunded classrooms, of kids who practiced on broken instruments or borrowed violins, of teachers who stayed late to tune guitars and mend drumheads. When it was nearly their turn, Elena stood and smoothed her dress. "Remember," she said, "just sing to me. Like we're back in the studio. No crowd, no cameras. Just us." He took a breath, nodded. Then they walked on stage. The lights were bright, but not blinding. The audience, maybe 200 people, sat quietly, expectantly. No phones out, no chatter. Just faces turned toward the stage, open and waiting. The pianist began. A single clear chord, then another. The melody rose, slow and tender. Mateo closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to find his center. And then he sang. His voice came out softer than at the restaurant, more contained, but somehow more powerful for it. He wasn't trying to fill the room. He was offering something to it. Each phrase felt like a gift, carefully wrapped and handed over. Elena's voice joined his, not above or below, but beside, like two paths meeting in a forest. They didn't look at the audience. They looked at each other. And in that shared focus, something passed between them. Trust, respect, the quiet joy of making beauty together. When the final note faded, there was no explosion of sound. Just a long, deep silence, like the whole room was holding its breath so as not to break the spell. Then slowly people began to stand, not all at once but one by one, until the entire theater was on its feet, clapping not with frenzy, but with reverence. Tears glistened on more than a few faces, teachers who'd fought for their music programs, parents who'd scraped together money for lessons, students who'd never seen someone their age treated with such dignity on a real stage. Backstage, Mateo's legs felt weak. Elena squeezed his shoulder. "You were magnificent," she whispered. He didn't feel magnificent. He felt whole, like he'd finally let a part of himself step into the light without flinching. After the concert, there was a small reception in the lobby. Cookies, punch, and tired but happy people hugging and talking. A little girl no older than 8 tugged on Mateo's sleeve. "Can you teach me to sing like that?" she asked, eyes wide. He knelt. "You already can," he said. "You just have to listen to your own voice." She smiled and ran off to find her mom. His parents found him near the coat check, looking a little dazed. "Proud doesn't even cover it," his father said. Voice rough. His mother just hugged him tight, her cheek resting on the top of his head for a long moment. Later that night, back home, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because something inside him had. He sat on the porch swing, the rain having finally stopped, the air cool and clean. Fireflies blinked in the neighbor's yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. He pulled out his phone. The video from the restaurant had millions of views now. Messages poured in. Offers, interviews, invitations to perform on national TV. One even promised stardom by summer. He didn't reply. He just turned off his phone and tucked it in his pocket. He didn't want stardom. He wanted to keep singing, not for crowds, not for cameras, but for the same reason he always had. Because it made him feel less alone. Because music was the place where his quiet heart could speak loudly, clearly, without having to explain itself. The next week at school, things settled. The buzz faded. Kids stopped asking about talent shows. Teachers stopped treating him like a celebrity. He was just Mateo again, the boy who sat in the back, who doodled clefs in his notebook, who never raised his hand unless called on. But something had shifted. During choir, when Ms. Delgado asked for volunteers to lead warm-ups, Mateo raised his hand. Not because he wanted attention, but because he finally believed his voice mattered, even in the everyday moments. He started staying after school once a week to help younger students with basic vocal exercises. He never called it teaching. He called it practicing together. And in those quiet afternoons, with the sun slanting through the music room windows, he found a new kind of joy, not in being heard by thousands, but in helping one kid find their own note. Elena invited him to sing at another community event a few months later, a park concert for families. He said yes. This time he wasn't nervous at all. He wore the same white shirt, sang the same way, honest, unhurried. And when a little boy in the front row started crying during the aria, not from sadness but from feeling something too big for words, Mateo knew he'd made the right choice. He never signed with an agent, never posted daily updates or chased viral fame. His parents kept their promise. His childhood stayed his. But every now and then, on a Friday night or a Sunday afternoon, you could find him at a small venue, a library event or a school fundraiser, standing beside Elena or sometimes alone, singing not to amaze but to connect. And in those moments, when his voice rose clear and true above the hum of everyday life, people didn't see a prodigy. They saw a boy who loved music enough to share it gently, without fanfare, without fear. And maybe, in a world that often shouts for attention, that quiet kind of courage was the most astonishing thing of all. The days after the benefit concert didn't feel like a turning point, at least not in the way movies make it seem. There were no flashing lights, no sudden fame, no parade of strangers knocking on the front door. Life in the small brick house on the south side of Chicago went on much as it always had. Laundry piled in the hallway, dinner at 6, homework under the kitchen light. But something had shifted inside Mateo, quiet and deep like a river changing course beneath the surface. He still walked to school with his head down, still sat in the back row, still spoke only when spoken to. But now when the choir teacher asked who wanted to try a solo line during rehearsal, his hand rose. Just a little, just enough, before he even realized he'd moved it. And when he sang, his voice didn't shake. It settled, like a bird finding its perch. Still, the world outside his neighborhood hadn't forgotten that night at the restaurant. The video kept spreading. A national morning show reached out again, this time offering travel, lodging, even a stylist. "We just want to share your story," the producer said over the phone, voice warm and persuasive. "You could inspire so many kids." His parents listened. They thanked her politely. Then they said no. "We're not saying never," his mother explained later, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. "But right now he's not a story. He's a kid, and kids need room to grow without a spotlight watching every step." Matteo agreed, though he didn't say it out loud. He'd seen what happened when people turned real moments into content. How quickly something tender could become a product. He didn't want his voice packaged and sold. He wanted to keep it soft, personal, like a secret shared only with those who truly listened. But saying no didn't make the offers disappear. A talent agency sent a glossy brochure. A music school in New York offered a full scholarship for exceptional young artists. Even a local theater group asked if he'd consider playing the lead in their youth production of Amal and the Night Visitors. He liked the idea of singing in a story, but the thought of memorizing lines, hitting marks, pretending to be someone else, it felt like too much. He loved music, not performance. What he loved most was the feeling he got when he sang alone in his room, or when he and Elena rehearsed in that quiet studio downtown. Just two voices, no audience, no expectations. That was where the magic lived, not in applause but in presence. One Saturday morning, Elena showed up at their door unannounced, holding 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the cafe down the street. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. They sat on the porch swing, the same one that creaked with every breeze. She didn't talk about concerts or contracts. She talked about her first voice teacher, a retired seamstress who taught her in a spare bedroom filled with spools of thread and old sheet music. She talked about the time she bombed an audition so badly, she cried in a subway bathroom for an hour. She talked about how easy it is to confuse being seen with being valued. "You have something rare," she said, blowing on her cup. "Not just your voice, but your instinct. You know when to step forward and when to stay still. Most adults never learn that." Matteo looked down at his hands. "I just don't want to lose it," he said quietly. The quiet part. "You won't," she said. "Not if you protect it." And that became their unspoken agreement. They'd sing together when it felt true, not because it was big, but because it mattered. No grand stages unless the purpose was real. No cameras unless the story was worth telling. A few weeks later, Elena invited him to a different kind of event. Not a concert, but a workshop at a public elementary school in a neighborhood where the music program had been cut years ago. The school had managed to scrape together enough donations for one afternoon of live music, and Elena wanted Matteo to come, not to perform, but to listen, to watch, to be part of something ordinary and beautiful. They arrived to a gymnasium filled with folding chairs and restless kids in mismatched uniforms. The piano was slightly out of tune. The microphone squeaked when Elena tested it. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the way a third-grade girl's eyes widened when Elena sang a lullaby in Italian. What mattered was the boy in the back who shyly raised his hand to ask, "Can anyone learn to sing like that?" Matteo stood near the piano, not on a stage, just part of the room. When Elena finished, she turned to him. "Would you like to try something with them?" He hesitated, then nodded. He didn't sing an aria. He taught them a simple round, Dona nobis pacem, 3 parts, easy to learn. He split the room into sections, showed them how to listen to each other, how harmony isn't about being the loudest but about fitting together. At first it was chaos, kids giggling, singing over each other, missing cues. But slowly something clicked. The voices began to weave. The room filled with sound that wasn't perfect but alive. When they finished, the whole gym clapped, not for him but for themselves. They'd made music together. And in that moment, Matteo understood something new. Singing wasn't just about expressing himself. It was about connecting. Afterward, as they walked to the car, Elena said, "That's the real work. Not the big stages. This." He knew she was right. Back at home, he started asking his parents if they could donate his old headphones to the school. Then his extra music books. Then he offered to go back, just to help, not to perform. His mother smiled. "You're becoming a keeper of music," she said. He didn't know what that meant exactly, but it felt like a good thing. Meanwhile, life at school continued its steady rhythm. He joined the after-school music club, not as a star, but as another member. He helped tune the old xylophone. He showed a sixth grader how to match pitch. He even started humming in the hallways sometimes, just little fragments of melody. And no one thought it was strange. They just smiled and kept walking. One afternoon, Ms. Delgado pulled him aside. "There's a city-wide youth arts showcase next month," she said. "Small audience. Mostly teachers, parents, other students. No press, no videos allowed unless families opt in. Would you consider singing something?" He thought about it. "What kind of songs? Anything that means something to you?" He nodded. "Okay, but just one." They chose Danny Boy. Not opera. Not flashy. Just a simple, aching melody about loss and love and coming home. He'd heard his grandfather sing it once years ago before he passed. It had stayed with him ever since. The night of the showcase, the auditorium held maybe 50 people. No fancy lights, no backdrop, just a piano and a wooden stool. When his name was called, he walked up, sat, and sang like he was in his room again. Soft, honest, unhurried. Afterward, a woman in the front row wiped her eyes. She came up to him during intermission. "My son used to sing that," she said. "He's overseas now. Thank you for bringing him back to me, even for a minute." Mateo didn't know what to say, so he just said, "You're welcome." That was the thing no one had told him. Music wasn't about being impressive. It was about being human. As spring turned to summer, the offers slowed. The internet moved on to the next viral moment. Mateo's video still lived online, but it wasn't trending anymore. And that was fine. Better than fine. It gave him space to breathe. He spent his summer days reading, biking around the neighborhood, helping his dad fix the porch steps. And every Thursday evening he met Elena at the community center for an hour of singing, just for practice, just for joy. Sometimes they worked on new pieces. Sometimes they just sang old favorites, laughing when they messed up. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Elena asked, "Do you ever wonder what it would be like? To go big? Touring, recordings, all that?" He thought for a long time. "I think I'd miss the quiet," he said finally. "The part where it's just me and the song. If I'm always performing, will I still hear it?" She smiled. "That's why you'll never lose it," she said. "Because you listen." And that was enough. He didn't need a career. He didn't need millions of followers. He just needed to keep singing, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, always with his whole heart. Because in the end, the most powerful voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones that stay true, even when no one's watching. By the time autumn returned to Chicago, the leaves turning gold and red along the sidewalks, Mateo had settled into a rhythm that felt like his own. Not the rhythm of fame or expectation, but something quieter, more like breathing. He still walked to school with his backpack slung over one shoulder, still sat in the back of the classroom, still spoke only when he had something real to say. But now, when music came up, whether in choir, in passing conversation, or during the rare school assembly, he didn't shrink. He stood a little taller, not because he wanted attention, but because he finally believed his voice belonged. The buzz from that night at the restaurant had long faded. The video still existed online, tucked into corners of the internet where curious strangers occasionally stumbled upon it, but it no longer defined him. No talent scouts called. No producers knocked. The world had moved on, as it always does, chasing the next bright thing. And Mateo was glad for it. He'd seen how quickly wonder could turn into pressure, how easily a moment of beauty could become a demand for more. What remained was something deeper, a quiet understanding between him and the people who truly mattered. His parents, his teacher, Elena, and even the kids at school who now sometimes asked him to help them match a note or figure out a tricky rhythm. He wasn't a prodigy to them. He was just Mateo, the boy who loved music, who listened more than he spoke, who showed up when it counted. One crisp Saturday in October, Elena called. "There's a small event next weekend," she said, "at the Community Arts Center. A fundraiser for instrument repairs in public schools. Just a few performers, intimate. Would you like to sing with me again? He didn't hesitate. Yes. They chose Panis Angelicus once more. Not because it was showy, but because it felt like coming home. It was a song about grace, about quiet gifts, about sharing something sacred without fanfare. It fit. The night of the performance, the art center was warm and softly lit, filled with folding chairs and familiar faces, teachers, parents, students, neighbors. No cameras, no live stream. Just people gathered to support something they believed in. Matteo wore the same white shirt he'd worn before, slightly worn at the collar now, but clean and pressed. He didn't feel nervous. He felt ready. When they walked on stage, there was no grand introduction. Elena simply nodded to the pianist, and the music began. Matteo closed his eyes for a heartbeat, found his breath, and sang. His voice was steadier now. Not louder, but surer, like a tree that's weathered a few storms and grown deeper roots. Elena's voice wrapped around his like a familiar embrace, and together they offered the room something gentle, something true. When they finished, the applause was warm but quiet, the kind that comes from the heart, not the hands alone. Afterward, a little girl, maybe 9 or 10, approached him shyly, clutching a notebook. Can I hear you sing something else? She asked. He smiled. Sure. What would you like to hear? She shrugged. Something happy. So right there in the hallway near the coat rack, with a few people lingering and the smell of apple cider in the air, he sang a simple folk tune his mother used to hum, just a few lines, soft and bright. The girl beamed. I'm gonna learn that, she said, and ran off to find her dad. That was the thing he'd learned. Music wasn't meant to be locked away on stages or saved for special occasions. It was meant to be shared, casually, kindly, whenever someone needed it. In the weeks that followed, he started doing small things. He volunteered at the school's after-hours music club, not as a teacher, but as a helper, tuning guitars, showing younger kids how to hold a recorder without squeaking, singing harmony during group songs. He never made a big deal of it. He just showed up. His parents watched him with quiet pride. They'd worried at first that the attention might change him, that he'd start chasing applause or comparing himself to others. But if anything, he'd grown more grounded, more himself. One evening, as they ate dinner, spaghetti again because it was cheap and comforting, his father said, You know, I used to think music was just noise. Pretty noise, but noise. Now I see it's something else. What? Matteo asked. A way to say things words can't, his father said, twirling pasta on his fork. You've been saying a lot lately. Matteo didn't answer, but he smiled into his plate. As winter approached, Elena invited him to join her for a holiday concert at a senior living center. Not a grand performance, just piano, 2 voices, and a room full of elders who remembered Pavarotti's early recordings and used to sing carols around upright pianos in their own living rooms. Matteo agreed. The day of the concert, snow dusted the streets. Inside the center, the air smelled of cinnamon and wool blankets. Residents sat in wheelchairs and armchairs, some dozing, some wide-eyed with anticipation. They sang Ave Maria, Silent Night, and an old Neapolitan lullaby Elena's grandmother used to sing. At one point, an elderly woman in the front row began singing along, her voice thin but clear, tears streaming down her cheeks. Afterward, she reached for Matteo's hand. You reminded me of my brother, she said. He sang like that before the war. He didn't know what to say, so he just held her hand for a moment. That was enough. On the drive home, Elena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, You have a gift, but not the kind people think. It's not your range or your tone, it's your kindness. You sing like you're giving something, not taking. He thought about that all the way home. By the time he turned 13, Matteo had stopped thinking of himself as a prodigy. The word felt too heavy, too shiny, like a trophy you're supposed to polish but never really use. He wasn't performing for judges or chasing viral fame. He was just living, with music as part of his everyday breath, like walking or talking or laughing. He still listened to old recordings in his room, still practiced when no one was around. But now he also sang at school events, at library story hours, at neighborhood potlucks when someone asked. He never demanded a stage. He just offered his voice when it felt right. And people listened not because he was famous, but because he was real. Years later, long after the video had faded into internet history, someone would mention that night at the restaurant, the boy who stunned everyone with his voice. Those who remembered would smile and say, Oh, him? He never became a star. And they'd be right. He never became a star. But he became something rarer. A person who stayed true to what mattered, who used his gift not for glory, but for connection. He sang not to be seen but to be present, not to impress but to comfort, not for millions but for the one person in the room who needed to hear it. And in a world that often confuses noise with meaning, that kind of quiet courage was the most astonishing thing of all.